Hey guys, today we'll be taking a look at the closest races for the 2022 gubernatorial elections, and so there are 36 races that we have this November to elect new governors, and there's obviously no way that we're going to be able to look at all of these races in one video. So I'm really only going to be focusing on the toss-up races, the toss-up states that really are going to decide which party has more governorships after the 2022 midterms. So of course, after the 2018 governor elections, the Democrats ended off with 23 governorships and 27 for the Republican Party. The Democratic Party, of course, did lose one after the 2021 governor elections, in which Glenn Youngkin flipped the state of Virginia, defeating Terry McAuliffe. So right now, the Democratic Party has 22 governors, and the Republican Party has 28. Now, to go back to a time in which the Democratic Party had more governors, you would really have to go back a very long time, back to 2009, in which the Democratic Party under Barack Obama held 26 governorships. So ever since Barack Obama was elected, the Democratic Party has trailed in the governorship numbers. At one point after 2016, they only held 16 governorships out of 50. In 2018, of course, this was when they were able to pick that number back up to 23. And in 2022, the Democratic Party, of course, is looking for more gains off of their 2018 victories. So I'm going to start off by filling in the solid and likely states. These are states in which the races really are not going to be too close. There are some states like Nevada in which typically would be a lot more of a contested race in like a presidential election, but on the Senate level, these races really are not going to be as close. Even states like Minnesota, Tim Walz is expected to win his re-election by some pretty strong numbers. And of course, in the state of Nevada, I don't think this race is going to be too contested either. Of course, we have Steve Sisolak running for his re-election, and I think that in the state of Nevada, he is going to do much better than Catherine Cortez Masto on the Senate level. In the state of New York, I am going to give the state as solid, even though there are rumors of Andrew Cuomo running as an independent. I do think that is not too unlikely, knowing Andrew Cuomo. However, for right now, I'm not going to factor that in too much because, of course, there's speculation about any number of candidates potentially running. And so the primaries for many of these states is coming up as well. We did have a few primaries earlier this month. We had the one in the state of Ohio, in which Mike Dewine won his renomination. And earlier last month, we, of course, had the Texas primaries that chose both Greg Abbott and Beto O'Rourke as the gubernatorial nominees. That, of course, was not too surprising at all. However, I do think that the state of Texas is not going to be that close of a race. I do think that Greg Abbott is going to have a pretty comfortable victory over Beto O'Rourke. So these are the 9 toss-up states that we have. These are really not 8 toss-up states. Iowa, I do think Kim Reynolds is going to have a relatively strong victory, but these 8 states, these are the ones that are going to decide the balance of power in terms of governorships for both the Democratic and Republican parties. So starting off with the state of Arizona. In the state of Arizona in 2018, Doug Ducey was reelected by a very strong margin of almost 15%. In 2022, he will be term limited, so there will be both a Republican and a Democratic primary, and many of the races that we have on this map right here, the ones in gray, the primaries are not until August, so really there is quite a long way to go at this point until we really see who the candidates are. And looking at this race in the state of Arizona, the primary is set for the 2nd of August. On the Republican side, Kari Lake, a former TV anchor, is the frontrunner, and on the Democratic side, we have Katie Hobbs, the current Secretary of State of the state of Arizona. And looking at the polls between these two candidates, you will see that between Hobbs and Lake, the latest poll does show Kari Lake up by 1 point. This was released around 3 months ago. However, going back to November, you will see that Katie Hobbs led Kari Lake by 4 points and 5 points in 2 of the other previous polls between the two. However, Katie Hobbs has led in every single poll that has been released, except for this one latest one against Kari Lake. So I do think that Katie Hobbs is a relatively strong candidate. Of course, she is the elected Secretary of State of the state of Arizona, so she has won statewide elections in the past. And I do believe that Katie Hobbs will do, of course, a lot better than what we saw from the Democratic Party in 2018 running against Doug Ducey. David Garcia was not a good candidate against Doug Ducey. Doug Ducey was still relatively popular. This was before, of course, he turned on Donald Trump and gave Joe Biden the election victory in Arizona that, of course, Joe Biden rightfully won. So I think that in the state of Arizona, the Democratic Party is currently at a little bit of an advantage. I do think that right now, Katie Hobbs does have a slight advantage just looking at the poll numbers. I'm not averaging these numbers or anything like that. I'm simply giving you my analysis of what these numbers mean. Of course, the date in which these polls were released is a major factor in that, and just what I think, these numbers tell us about the potential race in November. So, of course, the primaries have not happened in Arizona yet, so we may actually get different candidates, but right now, Kari Lake and Katie Hobbs have been their respective parties' frontrunners for quite a while now, and I do not expect too many of these frontrunners to fall before the primaries in a couple months. So in the state of Arizona, I do believe that the Democratic Party will be able to flip this from what we saw in 2018, where of course this was a very strong victory for Republican Doug Ducey. And the next state I want to look at is probably the state with the most vulnerable Democratic incumbent, and that of course is the state of Kansas. Yes, Kansas has a Democratic governor. I think that is surprising to some people. In 2018, Laura Kelly defeated Chris Kobach. Chris Kobach, of course, being a far-right candidate. That was very unpopular. He also even lost the Republican primary for Senate in 2020. So Chris Kobach is not electable within the state of Kansas or the Republican Party within the state of Kansas. So in 2018, Laura Kelly was able to win by 5% in the state of Kansas. She, of course, did not really get too close to 50%, which is 48% of the vote, but that was way more than enough, needed for her to actually win the race. In 2022, she is already the presumptive nominee, and she is probably going to win her renomination in August as well. This primary is on the same day as Arizona, being the 2nd of August. And looking at the Republican primary here, Derek Schmidt, the current Kansas Attorney General, is the frontrunner for the GOP primary. I think that this is going to be a very interesting race. If you look at the only two polls that have been released between the two, you will see that Laura Kelly leads in the most recent one. However, Derek Schmidt was leading in the previous poll released last year. Both of these polls were released in September of last year, but the issue here for Laura Kelly, I think, is that even though the latest poll does have her ahead of her Republican opponent, this poll was one that was funded by Emily's List, which is a PAC that funds progressive Democratic women. So Emily's List, a poll funded by this PAC is of course going to favor Laura Kelly. So I do think that the polls right now do still favor Derek Schmidt, and I think that Laura Kelly is going to have a very tough time running for re-election. If Democrats lose any governorship, the first race they're going to lose is going to be Laura Kelly's. I think Laura Kelly is in a very vulnerable position, and she really is going to have to do something to make up for it if she wants to win her re-election this November. She's determined to win her re-election, but in a state that voted for Donald Trump by over 15% in both 2016 and 2020, essentially, I believe the margin was a little bit under 20. I believe it was 14.7% for Donald Trump in 2020, but a state that voted for Donald Trump by solid margins both times, it is going to be very difficult for Laura Kelly to win if she's not running against some very unpopular candidate like Chris Kobach. And so moving on to the state of Wisconsin, Wisconsin is going to have a very important race as well, and trends do not favor the Democratic Party here either. In 2018, Tony Evers defeats Scott Walker, who was running for a third consecutive term. However, Tony Evers was, he won in 2018, and the issue for him here is that Wisconsin typically elects governors of the opposite party to the president. In 2018, Donald Trump was the president. Tony Evers, the Democratic candidate, defeats Scott Walker. In 2014, 2012 with the recall, and 2010 during the Obama presidency, Scott Walker was elected 3 times as Barack Obama was in office as the Democratic president. Going back to 2006, when George W. Bush was in the overall office, of course, Jim Doyle was the Democratic governor. 2000 2002, his first election in 1998 under Bill Clinton, of course, we had Tommy Thompson as a Republican. So the party that is in the Oval Office typically loses the Wisconsin governor race, and this goes back much further than the 1990s, and is a trend that we also see in many other states, as well, of course, just in general in doing well in midterm elections. The party that is in power typically does worse just because they're blamed for all of the problems in the United States. So I think that in 2022, Tony Evers, even though he is going to win his renomination, this nomination will happen on the 9th of August. Rebecca Kleefisch, the current frontrunner for the GOP nominee for the GOP nomination, and the former lieutenant governor of the state under Scott Walker, I think that she has a very real chance at flipping the state of Wisconsin. Looking at the polls that have been released, you will see that Tony Evers against Rebecca Kleefisch did lead in the two older polls that were released. However, these polls were released in August of last year, all of them in August. This first one was even released in March, which showing Evers +5. It was, although funded by Tom Nelson, which makes that even worse for Tony Evers. So I think that Tony Evers right now, the polling numbers do technically support him, but I think that just with how these numbers were released in August when Joe Biden's approval rating was still positive, I do think that currently Tony Evers is not in the best position. I think that if the election happened now, Tony Evers would lose. I don't think it would be a landslide in any way, but I do think that Rebecca Kleefisch right now does have that slight advantage. So this does put the Republicans at 25. Moving on east a little bit more to the state of Michigan, we of course have the governorship race here, and I think this is one to watch with Gretchen Whitmer, who won by almost 10% in 2018. In 2022, she is running for her re-election. The primary here is also in early August, on the 2nd of August as well. But in this Michigan race, she is probably going to be running against James Craig, the former chief of the Detroit Police Department. And looking at the polls between these two, I do think that Gretchen Whitmer, this is really the only good thing for Democrats at this point. Gretchen Whitmer is doing relatively well in this race in Michigan. Of course, in 2020, Gary Peters won by a pretty disappointing margin against John James for the Senate. So the state of Michigan is not as blue as it was before under Bill Clinton or Barack Obama. Joe Biden won the state by less than 3%. So Gretchen Whitmer, no matter what, just because of the fact that 2022 is going to be a red wave year, she is going to have a tough time winning her re-election, much harder than it was for her in 2018. And so I think that in 2022, Gretchen Whitmer's numbers are relatively okay, considering the fact that she is of course put at a disadvantage just from the beginning, just because of the national environment. So right now, I do think that Gretchen Whitmer has a slight advantage over her Republican counterparts, but I think that obviously we're going to have to wait a couple of months to see how this race plays out. In the state of Ohio, I'm going to say it right now, this race, of course, obviously favors the Republican Party just a little bit. I think that it would be shocking for the Democrats to have any sort of advantage in the state of Ohio, but in 2018, Mike DeWine was elected. In 2022, just a couple of days ago, Mike DeWine was renominated alongside Nan Whaley for the Democratic Party. And so both of these candidates are going to, be in a pretty close race for the next couple of months. With their primaries so early, this race is going to drag on for a while, which, does mean that, of course, more things can happen between the two. And so I do think that there is, a better chance that Democrats can pull some sort of upset in the next couple of months. However, that is still relatively unlikely. Mike DeWine won 48% of the vote of the Republican Party, which is relatively strong, considering that he really did face some pretty strong opposition from the Trump wing of the Republican Party. And of course, John Cranley did lose. Nan Whaley has been nominated. I do think that she is going to lose. It is still the state of Ohio. Nan Whaley won 65% of the vote. And, just looking at the predictions here, you do see the Republican Party has an absolute advantage in this race, but the polling numbers really do not suggest that. If you look at the four previously Republican-funded polls, you'll see that the poll between Mike DeWine and Cranley, Mike DeWine only leads by 2 points. Now, of course, this was not against Nan Whaley. This was against John Cranley. So, of course, I do get their names mixed up sometimes, but Mike DeWine only led by 2 points. He led by a smaller margin than every other candidate that was polled. And so Jim Renacci, he was the major person against Mike DeWine. He did the best in the primary against him, but Jim Renacci led by 10 points against John Cranley. Mike DeWine led by 2. I think that it's clear that Mike DeWine is the weaker candidate. He, of course, does appeal a lot less to the Trump wing of the Republican Party, and he probably loses support from them. So I do think that Mike DeWine is not the best candidate for the Republicans to run on the national level. I do think that Jim Renacci would actually perform better. The polling does agree with me on this, but I do think that Mike DeWine currently is still in a winning position and, definitely has a very good chance at winning his re-election. Moving on to the state of Pennsylvania, there's really not too much to talk about. There have been no polls released in 2022 from the state of Pennsylvania, but no matter what, it is going to be a very, very close race. The primary is in mid this month, actually, on the 17th. There really have not been too many polls that have been released, but Tom Wolf, who was reelected in 2018, will not be able to run for a third consecutive term, even though he won almost 58% of the vote last time. This is a very strong margin for a Democrat. So in 2022, I really don't see the Democratic Party doing anywhere close to a solid margin, but we really do not have too many polls. We do have polls for the Republican primary, which is a pretty large primary right now, and the current frontrunner is Doug Mastriano. So we're going to have to see how this plays out in the middle of, later this month. But I think that Pennsylvania, no matter what, on the Senate election level as well, Pennsylvania will be one of the races to watch this year. And finally, so I cannot make a classification for Pennsylvania. We do have 2 more states left. In the state of Maine, up here in the top right corner, I think that this is going to be another one of the more surprisingly close races, like we saw in Kansas with the Democratic governor. In the state of Maine, we have a Democrat who I think is also going to struggle just a little bit. In the state of Maine in 2018, Janet Mills was elected. In 2014, Paul LePage was reelected. So in 2010, Paul LePage was elected. 2014, we saw the reelection of Paul LePage. 2018, Paul LePage was term limited as he cannot run for a third consecutive term, but he can run for a third non-consecutive term, which is exactly what he's doing in 2022. That's why this race is going to be so interesting. We have a one-term governor and a former 2-term governor running against each other, with the one-term governor being the incumbent. So between these two, Janet Mills right now is polling just a little bit better, with the polls released from earlier last year. This one was even funded by the Democratic Party, was Democratic funded. So Janet Mills right now, I think that she does have a slight advantage in this race, but in the end, it is going to be very, very close, and what we see from the primary is not really going to change too much. The primary in Maine is going to be in early June, so we do have a little bit to wait there, but we do already have the presumptive nominees. In 2018, we have Brian Kemp in the state of Georgia. This is the final race on the map, of course. 2018, Brian Kemp defeats Stacey Abrams. This was a widely contested election, as well as one of the most closely watched, and Stacey Abrams did very, very well. In 2014, Nathan Deal won by almost an 8 to 9%. So in 2018, Stacey Abrams did very well for a Democrat, and she even helped Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff win their 2 Senate seats earlier last year. So in 2022, both of these candidates are expected to be renominated. Of course, David Perdue is running against Brian Kemp, but his campaign is likely to fail, and he will be running, of course, against Stacey Abrams. On the primary for Georgia is in late May, later this month. However, there will be a runoff on the 6th, on the 21st of June. That is if neither of these candidates win a majority. Of course, the runoff system does exist in the South, but I do think that both Brian Kemp and Stacey Abrams will survive and not go to a runoff. They'll both probably win a majority of the vote within their parties. And looking at the polls between the two, Brian Kemp is doing better than he was in 2018, which is not too surprising considering the national mood. Stacey Abrams is doing worse than she was earlier. So, of course, Brian Kemp up 5, up 6, up 8, and up 6 in the 4 recent polls that were released. So, I do think definitely the Republican Party has an advantage in this race. And so, going into the 2022 primaries, we are currently in early May, the Republican Party is at an advantage. Of course, they currently hold 27 seats. So, if Democrats do win this race in Pennsylvania, even if they do win this as a given, the Republican Party is still poised to hold on to their 27 governorships, with them, even possibly flipping the state of Kansas, as well as Maine and Arizona. Arizona, of course, being vulnerable for Republicans, Maine being vulnerable for the Democrats, and Pennsylvania is just a pure toss-up at this point that the Democratic Party is being forced to defend. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure you like it down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below how you feel about these classifications, as well as your outlook on the 2022 governor elections. Subscribe to my channel if you have not, and I'll see you guys in the next video.